My name is Claire Ellen Donovan. I'm 32 years old, and I live in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, a place of cornfields that turn gold in August and a steam of February mornings that smells like wood smoke and wet dog. I work 2 jobs, daytime at a non-profit counseling center and evenings at a small diner on Main Street, the kind with vinyl booths and coffee that never tastes like anything but the town itself. Right now, my life is quieter than it used to be. I sleep in a narrow bedroom above a storefront. I have a cat that reminds me to breathe, and on most days I feel like a mosaic made from chipped pieces of other people's lives. Emotionally, I am tired and weary and soft around the edges where old bruises haven't quite scarred over. Before I dive in, if you're into stories like this, honest, messy, real, please consider subscribing. Sharing this is raw for me, but maybe somebody out there needs to hear it. My parents were the kind of people who kept their family photographs organized by holiday and sentimentally labeled every shoebox of mementos. We lived in a creaky colonial with a front porch swing that squeaked when the humidity rose, and a kitchen where my mother Ellen always had a pot of tea steeping. If you're picturing a postcard family, that's what it looked like from the outside. Inside, there were rules that never had words attached to them. One of the most important was unspoken and razor-sharp: gratitude. I was adopted at 18 months. I remember being small and restless and learning early that silence could be a kind of shelter. My earliest memory is of the smell of my mother's perfume, a citrusy thing she wore the first year, and of my father Daniel, humming along to a song on the radio as he stacked firewood in the shed. They were warm to me. They loved me within their capacity, which I later learned had ceilings that weren't always visible until you hit them. When I was 12, they brought home Lila. She arrived with a small backpack and a stuffed rabbit missing one eye, and they called her our miracle. Lila was 5 when she came to us, with a laugh like clinking glass and hair that caught the light. They signed papers one humid Saturday in July and came back with a cake and a new set of rules for the house that seemed to have been created the day she walked through the door. Suddenly, there were therapists for Lila that were better than the ones I'd seen. Lila got violin lessons and orthodontics without a conversation. I got whispered reminders about luck and charity and a phrase that landed like a stone every time I complained: "You should be grateful just to be here." It's such a small sentence, weightless if you say it aloud, but it carried an anchor. It was a tidy morality that kept my mouth closed. I understood gratitude as a ledger. I knew, without being told, that my right to complain about anything was conditional. That knowledge made me small and careful. Sometimes I could feel my spine curling inwards so I would fit the shape of the people around me. The house smelled of different things depending on the season: cinnamon and baking in the winter, cut grass in the summer afternoons, bleach after my mother cleaned the bathroom to a shine she liked to show off. The living room had a carpet that still held the ghost smell of spilled juice from some forgotten birthday. Lila's stuffed rabbit ended up on the mantel the same week she was given a scholarship for a private school program. My bedroom had a poster with a band I loved, and I remember folding it away one day because it felt possessive to like anything that took space from the family's curated image. There were small things that built up over years like sediment. Lila's drawings were framed and hung in places where guests could see them. My drawings were tucked into a drawer. At school, I was the girl whose adoption was told like a bedtime story by Mrs. Patel, the teacher who meant well but had a way of making my life sound like a moral example. Claire was lucky, she'd say in front of the class. She had a family when some kids do not. Lila was lucky too, but she was also anointed. She always had 2 phone chargers in her backpack because one was failing and she was allowed to carry the spare. I was told to be grateful for the charger that worked. Why do they treat her like she's special? I asked my best friend Jess one afternoon in the diner where we ate greasy fries after school. Jess slid a curly fry across the table to me. "Maybe she needs them more," she said, and then, "Or maybe she just knows how to say thank you." It felt like a half answer and half rebuke. The thing that stung the most was that the adults in my life performed gratitude outwardly like a costume. My parents would tell friends at barbecues how thankful they were, how adopting had changed their perspective. They'd clutch Lila's hand like a trophy. When I argued, quietly, because arguing loudly got me recipes for better behavior and long lectures about humility, My protests were met with that soft, impenetrable line. You should be grateful just to be here. I learned to say, I know, and tuck the ache away. I learned to measure my wants in tiny increments, to ask for permission before needing something. I remember nights lying awake listening to the house breathe, hearing the sound of my mother folding laundry in the dark, the click of the dryer like a metronome that kept time for the family. I would hold my knees to my chest and feel the cold plaster of the ceiling and think, without the vocabulary then, that love could be an uneven thing, distributed by favor rather than need. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. I don't say that lightly. The story of favoritism and adopted children is not everyone's, but I know it's many people's, and it's important that we aren't alone in feeling the hurt. There were moments that glittered with normalcy. Lila taught me how to braid hair and to lie on warm asphalt in August and watch for satellites. We shared a toothbrush once when we were young and silly, and the memory of that small intimacy is complicated now. It is both a jewel and a splinter. She wasn't all villain. She laughed in a way that could make the whole house softer. She would pull me into a fit of whispered secrets when our parents were distracted by whichever charity dinner they were planning. Sometimes, when she wasn't being adored for existing, she'd press her forehead to mine and whisper, "Do you think they like you?" And I would lie and say yes. The first major crack came the winter I was 16. The house had that thick, hurtful quiet you get when snow presses hard against windows and makes the world feel contained. My father had been working more than usual. Nights tending the restaurant he'd always said he loved, mornings at bookkeeping. My mother had started taking Lila to a private therapist twice a week, a woman in downtown Lancaster whose waiting room smelled of lemon oil and lavender. When I asked why I didn't get to see her, my mother said, without looking up from folding towels, "You don't need it like she does." Need it? I echoed. You'd think the word was a knife, the way it cut. What does that even mean? She set the towels down slowly, her hands smoothing the cotton in a gesture that had once been about comfort and now felt like dismissal. "Claire," she said, voice measured and deliberate, "you have a good life. Be grateful. Some kids don't get to have what you have." "But I do get to have it," I said, perhaps more loudly than I intended. "But I..." The look she gave me was precise, practiced. Part pity, part annoyance. "Please, Claire. You should be grateful just to be here." I left the room before I could say anything else. Outside, the snow clung to the hedges and the streetlight hummed. I felt hollow, that familiar smallness, and a new surge of fury that tasted like iron. It was the first time I understood that the phrase was not a reminder but a scolding ball and chain, a sentence meant to close my mouth before I'd even formed the word, why. When I was alone in my room later, my knee bouncing under the covers like some internal drum, I promised myself I would not be so small forever. I promised, in those teenaged vows that have the durability of fragile things, that I would find a way to be big enough to hold my own life. But promises with no direction are like paper boats in a storm, and I had no map. And yet the house kept functioning. Lila continued to be the golden child, and I continued to be the grateful one. The rhythm of that winter hummed like a broken lullaby, and I started to file away my anger like a secret, a small stone I carried in my pocket to make sure I was still there. I won't stop here. This is where things get heavier, where choices are made, and old loyalties are tested. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I promise it's not a neat story. Adolescence stretched and sharpened everything. At school I became adept at smiling at cafeteria tables, at making jokes so people would not ask what was really wrong. My nights were an exercise in watching shadows lengthen under my bedroom door and cataloging the way voices sounded through walls. The town of Lancaster has a particular hush after 10 p.m., when the diner sign buzzes and the only lights left are from porches with careful curtains. I learned to map my life around those hours. Lila's life seemed to get more oxygen with each passing year. When she started middle school, she was enrolled in a magnet program downtown, bus rides and stacks of glossy brochures congratulating us for enrolling her. She had a therapist whose desk faced the window and whose credentials hung like medals on the wall. My parents, at social events, would glide past other people's children and say, "Yes, Lila is excelling. We're so proud." Their pride tasted like sugar and something bleached. Once, at a summer barbecue, my mother announced to a friend with a ribbon in her hair, "We wanted to make sure Lila had every advantage. After all, she came from such a hard place." Everyone nodded, and the plates passed around like currency. I watched the exchange from the backyard where the grass smelled sweet and was still warm from the afternoon sun. A fourth of a mile away or someplace else, I couldn't tell. My voice felt different when I said it aloud. "I came from a hard place too," I wanted to say, "but you never frame me like that." Instead, I cut my watermelon into precise slices and offered them to people with a smile. It was easier to be the one who could be relied on to pass the salad bowl. People prefer tidy stories. The thankful daughter whose gratitude is part of the family identity, the adopted child whose presence proves the parent's kindness. The messy parts, the ways kindness can be conditional, how love can be rationed, are inconvenient children at the table who had to be fed in the kitchen. The first time I confronted my mother directly was the summer I turned 19 and had started community college during the day and waitressing nights. I had saved a small stack of money and wanted to take a photography class downtown that cost a bit more than my tuition. It felt like a piece of me I wanted to reclaim. "I want to take this one class," I told her, my hands twisting the hem of my shirt into folds. "I can pay for most of it, but I need a little help." She put down the dish towel she was using to dry glasses. The kitchen smelled of lemon and fried onions. "How much?" she asked. $200, I said. It wasn't much. It was coffee and a couple of shifts at the diner. "I can do the rest." She blinked, then smiled in a way that had once been warm and now felt like a test. $200, she repeated. "Claire, you have everything you need. School, meals, a roof. We can't exactly fund every hobby." My throat tightened. "I just want to learn, Mom." She sighed, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat. "You should be grateful just to be here, Claire. There are kids who don't even have that option." The words landed like a verdict. There was a sharpness to my anger that night, something that made me feel both adolescent and ancient at once. I thought of Lila, practicing scales on a borrowed violin in the living room, the same notes my mother hummed when she thought no one was listening. I thought of all the small ways investment and attention had been parceled out like candy on a holiday morning, and how I had been taught to watch only with gratitude. I left for my shift with my camera tucked in my bag, its strap rubbing my shoulder raw. That night at the diner, under the jaundiced hum of fluorescent lights, I took pictures of hands and faces and the steam that fogged the coffee pots. The pictures felt like a secret I could carry out of the house. I started to develop them in a makeshift darkroom in my apartment bathroom, the smell of developer and fixer like an incantation. It was the only place I could make images that belonged only to me. At 21, I was accepted into a vocational program in Philadelphia for social work. I remember the day I told my parents. The sky was a washed-out blue and the bus smelled faintly of diesel and summer. Lila was on the couch scrolling through her phone, and my mother looked up from a recipe book as if the news were a mild interruption. "That's great, Claire," my father said, in a tone that could fit either congratulations or a trimmed condolence. "You'll do good there." My mother added, "We'll help when we can, but you know we have to be careful. We can't fund everything." There it was again, the ledger. "Be grateful just to be here." Each time those words were spoken, the muscle around my jaw tightened. I found myself chewing on them like seeds and tasting bitterness, the taste of someone who has been given something but told it's a favor rather than a right. The message was clear. My mere presence was charity. My ambitions were indulgences that could be edible only if seasoned with gratitude. There were more volatile moments, too. Once, when I was 23 and living on my own for the first time in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, I came home to find a letter on my kitchen table. My mother had written me a 4-page letter about the family finances and how they would be reorganizing their savings to ensure Lila could study abroad. The letter was meticulous and tender, written in her careful hand, but it read like a scheduling notice. When I called to ask why I hadn't been consulted, she answered like someone surprised by an interruption. "I'm doing what's best for the family." "You're doing what's best for her," I corrected, heat in my chest. She paused, and for a split second I thought I'd hear remorse. Instead she said, slow and sure, "You should be grateful just to be here, Claire. We've given you so much." I remember leaning against my sink, the ceramic cool against my hip, chest heaving. Tears pooled in the corners of my eyes like rainwater. I felt the world narrow to a single point. It was an old ache resurfaced with a new kind of fury. I felt betrayed by the people who had promised forever. I felt foolish for wanting more than what they were willing to validate. But beneath everything, there was a quieter, smarter part of me that started taking notes. It observed who was loved and who was given evidence of love. It catalogued dates and gifts and appointments. It watched the pattern form like a bruise. If this is resonating with you, a like really helps us reach more people. It helps stories like this find someone else who might need them. I never expected it to be easy to keep telling these memories aloud, but I know the way silence can compound pain if not shared. The pattern hardened into behavior. I stopped bringing up things that mattered. I stopped asking for more than the barest help. I became my parents' model child in one narrow sense, the one who did not protest too loudly. But inside, I had a growing collection of small rebellions. I saved money for therapy on my own. I took night classes in photography and social work. I cried into my pillow sometimes, and sometimes I laughed until I felt dizzy. I learned the language of self-preservation, boundary, no, this is mine. And through all of it, Lila remained both a comfort and a wedge. She would call me late at night sometimes, her voice small. "Do you think they're being fair?" she'd ask. "Fair to who?" I would reply, and the question never had an easy answer. Sometimes, when the moon was thin and the world felt like it was at a delicate balance, I would tell her, "I think they love in pieces." She would breathe out and then say, "Me too," and I would believe her because children, even favored ones, inherit the same fractured maps we do. Sooner or later, these fissures are going to need excavation. Secrets live beneath them, and the next part is where the foundation cracks open, and where I find something that will change my understanding of my whole childhood. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how the truth unfolded. I promise the next part is where the story truly sharpens. The worst part about going home was that the house remembered me like a photograph remembers the light, unchanged in posture but full of ghosts. I returned the summer my father's restaurant started failing. Daniel Donovan had always been a man of small kindnesses. A repair made late at night, a soft word in family disputes, a way of making guests feel like they belonged. With the restaurant struggling, his patience thinned and the air in the house sharpened. My mother, who'd always been tidy to the point of ritual, started leaving notes on the fridge about schedules and money and things they could do to cut costs. Gratitude as a currency grew more expensive than ever. When my father told me he and Ellen were splitting, the words landed like a backhand. I felt all my old, smaller selves tumble forward, those versions of me always waiting for an explanation. The divorce was not a catastrophic shouting match. It was a long, cool subtraction. Papers signed over months. Meetings scheduled in attorney offices that smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. My parents were civil enough to keep things presentable, and that civility became its own form of cruelness. They kept appearances and traded the intimacy of truth for the safety of choreographed acts. Lila, 17 now, became the center of a new web of negotiations. She needed stability, or so they said. She needed continuity or she would suffer, they claimed. They praised themselves for being responsible adults, the kind who prioritized children's needs during family upheavals. That line, the one about needs, was like a band-aid stretched over a bruise. It made the outside look fine while pressing down on what was actually wrecked underneath. It was during this time that I started to suspect there were things I didn't know. Small details accumulated and resisted my attempts to fit them into my house-shaped box of knowledge. An email left open on my father's laptop for a minute too long. A bank statement that slipped under a stack of postcards. The quiet way my mother would stare at family photos like she was calculating something invisible. One afternoon, sorting through boxes in the dusty attic where the light slanted in through one small window, I found a folder my mother had labeled in her neat, looping handwriting, Adoptions/notes. Curiosity made me clumsy. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper, and my pulse thumped in my ears. Inside the folder were stacks of documents, adoption paperwork, letters from an agency, and, most sharply, a series of email printouts between my parents and someone at an adoption agency. I almost dropped the pages when I saw the dates. They were from years before Lila arrived, and the language in them was clinical and transactional in a way my mother's warm words at dinner never were. One email in particular stopped me cold. It was from a caseworker named Margaret, and it discussed placements and long-term commitment, and, in an economy-minded parenthetical, the charitable tax advantages and public profile benefits. The words made my stomach lurch. The line was precise and ugly. Given your philanthropic profile and willingness to take a child on, Claire seems like a compassionate match, and it will, of course, be a generous narrative for your community involvement. I read it again and felt the attic tilt. I felt old memories reframed into objects. The knitting of my childhood could be untangled and restitched to show another pattern. There were other pieces of correspondence, polite and almost breezy, that discussed funding for therapy for trauma-informed placements, and the possibility of naming rights in a community pamphlet. In one letter, my mother had written, "We can handle this. We want to show others how to do good." The air left me. I sat on a trunk and the wood was cool beneath me. The realization that I might have been chosen as part of a larger plan that included social standing and public praise, that my existence had been, in some twinging sense, curated, was like a sharp, personal betrayal. I had been told my presence saved my parents' lives, but somewhere in those papers my story was rephrased into an act of charity that bolstered their image. I carried the folder downstairs and into the sunlight that spilled onto the kitchen table. My mother was making tea, her movements automatic. The kettle hissed. I held up the papers like a shield. "Mom," I said, voice thinner than I wanted. "Why is there an agency email that talks about tax advantages and my adoption as a charitable narrative?" She blinked slowly and set the mug down with exaggerated calm. "Claire, those are business details. You were always a gift to us. You know that." "A gift?" I echoed. "A gift we were public about and drew benefit from." The sentence came out acid sour. She sighed, a deep, tired sound. "That's unfair to say. We loved you. You called it a narrative to impress other people," I said. "The attic papers were a mirror that reflected a stranger into our kitchen. You literally wrote it." "It's complicated," she said, and then the phrase, that contractual silence, slipped into place. "You should be grateful just to be here." That time, my response wasn't a small suppression. I felt myself change. There was a tectonic click inside my chest. Grateful? For being used as decoration. The words surprised me with their strength. She looked hurt. Her lips thinned. "Claire, you are cruel when you say that." "I'm not being cruel," I said. "I'm being truthful." The conversation created an echo chamber of accusations and defenses. My father, when I told him later, tried a different tact. "Shame. We've done so much for you. You make this sound like a contest." "Is it a contest when there's a ledger that lists benefits and advantageous narratives?" I shot back. He stared at me like I'd grown another face. There were nights after that when I would lie awake and imagine the small moments of my childhood being annotated by someone elsewhere. How I held a crayon, how my mother kissed my head, how people in the community clapped at the story of our family. It was not that those small, loving things had not happened. They had, but they were being reinterpreted into currency by adults who had learned to market compassion. It felt filthy to possess the knowledge that my own life had been used to advertise the kind of parents they wanted to be. I did not confront the agency. Confrontation felt like a finality that would not bring any repair, only a reopening of wounds. Instead, I started to make plans. I took a job that helped me pay off debt, saved money, and continued to study. The more I built outside the house, the smaller the house felt in my bones. But secrets like the ones in that folder never entirely stay hidden. They leak. The next leak came with a discovery that changed everything again. a legal document folded inside a cookbook, a codicil to my parents' will, and suddenly, the ledger was not just moral but material. It dictated where the house would go, and Lila's name sat like a laurel wreath at the top of it. The will was precise. The property and the bulk of their savings arranged in such a way that favored Lila. When I asked my mother why, she said, "Lila needs stability. She came from a rougher start." "You said I was lucky to be here," I said. "What does that even mean if you plan it this way?" She looked away, and for the first time I felt something like regret, or perhaps the weight of responsibility. "We just want to make sure she'll be okay," she murmured. This is where the story fractures. The realization that the people you expected to protect you also planned your displacement. The next part is about the confrontation that finally opened up what had been simmering for years. If this is getting heavy for you, remember to breathe. And if you're still with me, consider sharing this. Sometimes these stories find people who need to know they are not alone. Everything that had been a slow erosion coalesced into a single, electric moment the day the attorney's office arranged a family meeting to read the will. The conference room smelled faintly of furniture polish and coffee that had been staying warm for too long. The table was a long rectangle of uneasily neutral wood. My mother sat at one end, hands folded like a prayer. My father beside her, face drawn. Lila across from me, hair pulled back, eyes resolute but trembling. The lawyer read the document with the same cadence you use to announce a verdict. Assets had been distributed and specifics attached like fine print that left little room for ambiguity. The house, the small property, the majority of savings. They went to Lila with a trust set up in her name for educational and care expenses. I had been given a smaller allotment, earmarked as a gesture for upkeep of my current living space and in recognition of early family support. I heard the sentences, but they felt like someone else's story being narrated, distant and slightly muffled. When the lawyer's eyes found mine, I saw professionalism as armor. He finished and sat back, the air around him resettling. "If there are any questions," he said. We all had questions. My mother had a folded smile that read as gentle and final. She believed, perhaps, her decisions were prudent and fair. Lila reached over and took my mother's hand, and the gesture pierced me somewhere between anger and pity. For a moment, I saw Lila as someone ensnared by the same patterns we all were. She had been loved and shaped by people who measured love by what they could afford and show publicly. Her complicity, if it was complicit, might have been survival, and survival often looks like selfishness when viewed from the outside. When we left the office into the parking lot, the sun was bright enough to make the asphalt gleam. "Why did she get it all?" I asked, the words bristling. "She came from a rougher start," my mother offered again, like proof. "She needs stability." "Are you telling me my stability is worth less?" I snapped. The old ledger language rose up like bile. "You were given a home," my father said, in that prone to polite tone. "You should understand that not everyone gets what we can give." It was as if their voices wore gloves, careful and removed. The thing that burned me was not just the distribution of money, though that stung. It was the framing, the moral justification that made my life into an example for their generosity, that allowed them to deflect note of their partiality with sanctimony. After the funeral, my mother died unexpectedly of complications from surgery. The grief was a raw, ragged thing, and it pulled at the braid of our family until it frayed. The house became a battleground of small things. Who kept the family silver? Who took the framed diplomas from the wall? In one of those exhausted, messy afternoons of paperwork and visitors, I found a short, handwritten note tucked inside my mother's Bible. It said simply, "Do not fight over money. Remember what matters." What mattered, evidently, was not my lived experience as a young woman who'd been taught to be grateful for a roof. What mattered was a belief that public good could justify private imbalance. That note felt like a sliver of balm, and also another example of the way my family prioritized appearance over honesty. I confronted Lila after the funeral, in the late dusk on our porch where the cicadas hummed like static. The house behind us was dark, the rooms we'd shared like a museum of moments. The porch smelled of old wood polish and night air. Lila sat on the swing and looked small and exhausted. "Do you know?" I asked. Did you know what Mom and Dad were planning? She stared at her hands. Some of it. Not all. I thought they were doing the best they could. Did you ever tell them not to do it at my expense? She looked up, and in the dim light I saw something I had always missed, a little girl who wanted to be wanted. I don't know how to fight like that, she said. Her voice was papery. I always thought, if I didn't show how grateful I was, they'd take it back. The admission landed differently than anything else. It didn't absolve her. It didn't erase my anger. But it changed the arithmetics of blame. Lila had been taught to perform gratitude in order to keep the love flowing. She had learned that compliance was the currency to remain beloved. You took their side, I said because I had to say it. You let them tell you stories about charity. You let them make me feel like dirt. She flinched. I didn't know it did that to you, she whispered. Claire, I'm sorry. I thought we were all just figuring things out. Figuring things out, I echoed, laughing with a sound that tasted like broken teeth. Maybe. But the maps were made before we even learned how to read them. There were other confessions, late-night conversations that unspooled into the early morning. Lila told me about the therapist my mother had placed her with, an expensive place that taught gratitude as a therapy, as if putting on the right face could heal trauma. She told me how my parents had spoken at fundraisers about the beauty of adoption, how their story had become a moral example that people clapped for and wrote checks to emulate. She had been clapped for living there. I had been made into a cautionary, quietly hidden lesson, an inconvenient truth dressed in gratitude. The more we talked, the clearer it became that the harm was systemic rather than purely malicious. Parents had made choices that benefited their social standing and, perhaps, their sense of righteousness. They'd used language like necessity and charity to wedge certain lives into corners. They'd told us both to be grateful, but they gave one of us more literal resources to fulfill that expectation. I used to think of fairness as an even distribution, a mathematical thing. But fairness in families is layered with history and fear and shame. Lila and I were both products of those layers. She begged for approval. I wanted equal footing. The two desires had collided for years beneath polite dinners and church picnics. In the months that followed, I stopped asking for fairness from other people. I stopped expecting my parents to correct the ledger. Instead, I leaned into work and therapy and small acts of care for myself. I began to paint again and took long walks along the river where the air smelled of algae and oil from distant barges. There was a season where the physical world felt like the only honest thing. The grit of a walking path under my soles, the way cold air bit my cheeks and made me feel alive. Those sensory truths were steadier than promises made by complicated adults. Rebuilding isn't a dramatic montage with triumphant music. It is a series of small, stubborn tasks. Opening a savings account, answering emails and saying no when a shift would bleed me thin. It is choosing therapists who don't insist gratitude as a cure for structural favoritism. It is learning to cook things I once thought my mother would disapprove of and painting canvases with colors I felt had always been forbidden. After the will and the funeral and the attic discoveries, I moved out of Lancaster for a while. Philadelphia had its clatter and endless neighborhood sprawl where nobody asked me about my family history unless I brought it up. The separation was a kind of inoculation, not enough to forget but enough to stop the disease of other people's expectations from defining the cells of my life. I took a job with a community mental health clinic serving low-income neighborhoods. The clients smelled like the street and the clinic smelled like antiseptic and possibility. It was, in its own way, honest work that felt less performative than being the trophy adoption daughter. Lila and I spoke sporadically at first. Our calls were halting and small and then gradually something grew. The quiet creation of a relationship that wasn't mediated by our parents' need to look good. We met for coffee in winter and sat in parks in spring. We learned to apologize. We learned to ask questions without assuming malice. She told me about a scholarship program she'd applied to, and I helped edit her essays. I told her about my own fear of always bargaining for affection. She made me a playlist she said reminded her of when we were kids and I cried in my car listening to it. There were hard days. I had nightmares for a long time. The house again, voices asserting that I should be grateful just to be here. And me shrinking. My therapist taught me grounding techniques. Feet on the floor, names of things in the room, the inhalation of the present moment. I learned to say no without dissolving into guilt. Saying no was a muscle. It took repetition and care. Eventually, I met someone in a volunteer reading program. His name was Omar, and he had a laugh like a quick wind. He taught me how to make coffee the way he liked it, and I taught him about darkroom chemistry. He listened without a ledger, without tallying up sacrifices and rewards. He was quietly revolutionary. He treated me like someone with a right to request things. He didn't ask me to be grateful for his presence as compensation for the way other people had failed me. Our relationship was a steady, ordinary thing, not the fix-all conclusion of a story. He helped me see that healing is not a destination but the art of showing up for yourself. A year after everything had been read and said and mostly done, I returned to the house for one last time. To clear out the attic and take down the framed pictures that meant nothing anymore. The house smelled of dust and decaying paper. There was a quiet that felt like a held breath. I packed my things amid the detritus of a manufactured life and, on the way out, I caught my reflection in the living room window and scarcely recognized the girl who had once practiced silence like a survival tactic. She was still there in edges, but she had new contours too. The act of leaving was not dramatic. It was a door closing gently after a long, creaking tenure. What I have learned, in ways both gentle and sharp, are a few things I want to leave here, because if my story can help someone else unlearn harmful lessons, then the hurt might have a meaning that isn't purely waste. First, gratitude is not a shackle. You can be grateful for what you had and also angry about what you didn't get. Those emotions are not mutually exclusive. Holding resentment does not negate gratitude. It complicates it. Second, people teach you how to be loved. For better or worse, my parents' way was to show love as a public narrative and sometimes to weaponize gratitude. You can unlearn that. This takes time. It also takes other people who will let you be imperfect and still stay. Third, fairness is not always measurable by money. When my parents gave Lila more of the estate, money was the visible artifact. But the harm was also in the stories they told to themselves and others. Stories that made my childhood into a moral exhibit. Healing is about reclaiming your narrative from the people who tried to explain it for you. Fourth, we are not reducible to our beginnings. Being adopted, being told to be grateful to exist, being the child who didn't get the same orthodontist or private lessons. Those things are parts of my story, not my whole identity. I am also the woman who learned to develop photos in a bathroom turned darkroom and to sit with people who are scared and to make lunch for herself when the sky is bruised. If this story has stayed with you, if it's touched something raw, please consider subscribing. Telling this has helped me heal in ways I didn't anticipate. And if you ever need to share your own story, about family pain, favoritism, or just the complicated work of loving people who also hurt you, the comments are open. I read everything. At the end of the day, I choose boundaries more than I choose drama. I choose to keep Lila in my life because she is the person closest to me who understands the sound of the house when it creaks. I choose to keep loving, but on terms that do not require my shrinking. The final lesson is both small and hard. Gratitude given to you is a gift. Gratitude demanded of you is a weight. Learn the difference. Carry what you need. Leave the rest where it belongs.